So when did you reunify with your mother?
Okay, so when we were put into the children's home, which I was talking about a little bit earlier, when we were put into the children's home, and it was about child sexual allegations and so forth, and my father's competency because he'd let my sister go off with this gentleman or person for a weekend. Now, that leads to other questions, which I'll probably touch on later, and like who would do that? And this gentleman was found with photos of him and my sister. And that was explained to us at that age too, once we're in the thing. So for my father to get us children back, he had to go to court and do a custody sort of battle or whatever we want to call it. It wasn't really fully explained to me. And they contacted, they being the child services or the government, whatever form agency, contacted my mother. And then she came back into our lives. So she came and visited at the children's home. And I remember that we were, my sister and brother and I were excited because it's our mother.
Yeah.
We didn't have, I have memories of my mother. I don't think my brother and sister do. My brother especially wouldn't. He was the youngest. He would not have known her, really. So it was the concept of a mother. And then she came in and she gave us presents, you know, the first time. And then after a while, every time she visited, we were like, where's presents, where's presents, where's presents? So she was sort of like, in some respect, more of a Father Christmas sort of figure rather than a person. And then the court case was concluded.
Were
and
you
my
at
father
the
won.
court? Were you
No,
at the
no,
court?
no. We were not involved in anything.
I mean, around the court, or you just kept way out of the whole process?
We were in the children's home until they came back and said, your father's won the court case, you're going home with your father. Your mother didn't win the court case. She didn't even win partial custody of the kids.
Wow.
So this is the court system, right?
Wow,
He was
Dawn.
an alcoholic.
I know.
Yeah, alcoholic, violent. There was child sexual allegations. All right, all sorts of competency questions were in the place. When the police came and picked us up that night that I told you about, they just woke us up. The place was in a shambles. Okay, there would have been empty casks lying around. I know that the bedroom that I was living in was just in a dirty and unkempt state. Okay, so this would have been all in the police report, and yet we still went back with him permanently.
So
100% custody.
was there
100%.
investigations into those allegations of this molestation or any of that? What
I
happened?
think, well, once again, it wasn't really a topic that we touched on, so
You didn't.
I don't know, but I do think that the allegations would have been about this person, this other person, and he would have been maybe you know, in prison, incarcerated or whatever. And my father probably pleaded the act of stupidity. You know, like, I didn't know what he was doing. I didn't think that if I let my, you know, 6-year-old, 7-year-old daughter go away with this person for a weekend that anything would occur. It seems all innocent, you know, and I've got my theories about what happened later on in life as an
Right.
adult. You know, I think
know
she's
if your
probably
mom-
pimped out.
Sorry, I didn't mean to step over you.
No, you're right. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if you knew if your mom was trying to get custody, all of it, or part of it, or just wanted to be in your lives. Do you know? Did you ever talk to her later to find out what was her involvement in the court?
No, I never asked the question. And there's a lot of things I don't ask. There's a part of me that just doesn't care enough, and there's a part of me that just probably wants to avoid conflict, because I was also trained, as I said earlier, any form of conflict from an early age, any form of conflict led to violence. There was a 0 to 100 sort of situation. Everything escalated. You didn't discuss things amicably and say, well, I see you have your point of view and I have my point of view. Let's just agree to disagree. It was basically my way, the highway. And if you don't like that, here's a slap.
That's another thing in common too, is this avoidance of conflict that we grow up with, and we don't know how to deal with it.
Yep.
Oh yeah, I find it very difficult to avoid or to deal with conflict. Even now as an adult, I will basically go straight from trying to ignore or trying to mollify, to calm, to avoid, to going for the throat.
Wow.
So, and that's why I do try to avoid conflict as well. I don't have a very great conflict resolution. So it's like a, I suppose it's like going, if I get into a conflict, my thought process is that it's a fight for life, a fight to the death. So I don't do it just for fun. I don't do it just because it's a conflict resolution. That's how life works. It's leave me alone, leave me alone, leave me alone, or I'm going to kill you.
Wow.
And that's metaphorical, but that's, yeah, I
Right.
don't hold back once I'm pushed to that point.
But it takes a long time to get that reaction, and so we're not dealing with that on a healthy level. And I know at least
No.
you wanted to say something.
No, I repress a lot of stuff.
There's either
I
one
carry it
end or
around.
the other. Yeah.
Yeah, I repress a lot. I carry it around. It manifests in unhealthy outbursts. So I'm an alcoholic. I have addiction issues. So I've just now pushed those addictive tendencies into probably more positive results, but still they're addictions.
Yeah.
Whether it would be house renovations and trying to and gardening and things like that, to the point where they become obsessive because of my addictive personality. And I think that's because I need some sort of routine and rhythm. So one of the questions that was asked a little bit earlier was, when I was put into that children's home, after the first initial shock of dislocation, I actually enjoyed being there. I loved it. It was a routine, a rhythm. People were nice. Yeah, it felt normal. I had nice clothes to wear. I had food all the time. We were given entertainment and books. There was playtime. They had their own school on the grounds. So I went to school, and I was really unhappy when we had to come back home, because I've walked out of this place which was warm and loving and friendly and with nice clothes. I was given back the dirty, dingy little clothes that I wore into that children's home the night that they took us from our beds. And we went home and we walked into this little flat, and I was just unhappy. And then he was drinking that same night, celebratory drinking. And I think he took us
back to
it. The house was cleaned up. But, you know, I didn't really stay that way long. And then he took us that same night, I believe, to visit one of his drinking buddies. So us three kids were dragged along with him like a flock of kids while he went from one drinking buddy to another drinking buddy. These guys were, I mean, this is housing commission. I grew up in a housing commission area, and they were, I wouldn't say disreputable, but they're not, you know, these are guys who are down in their luck, alcoholics, living by themselves in their, yeah. So, you know, that's who we were associated with and hung around with. So,
where was
I
Mum
loved
at this point? Sorry.
Okay, so once the custody battle was won, Dad actually granted her visitation rights, like just on a personal, private level, I suppose. He said, yes, you can take them one weekend, a fortnight. And so she came back into our lives at that point. So I think he probably, I don't know, he crested his anger and his hurt and betrayal, whatever emotions were going on for him, his abandonment, what have you. I mean, he wasn't really nice about her up until that point. And even then, he, I suppose, tried to get her back into our lives, but it was on his terms. I mean, he had full authority. So,
Do you think he used that to his advantage when he was dealing with her?
I don't know. I don't really investigate it that much. It was just a new stage, and I just accepted it. So
now your father's passed, isn't he?
yes.
So what happened? Were you weren't speaking to him during that time that he passed either, were you? What was the timeline like between then and when your father passed? What was school like for you growing up? Because I know that you're highly intelligent. You actually won the Caltex Award in Victoria, which is the huge, big time academic award. But what was your schooling like? Because the research often says that children in severe PA and growing up in these situations really struggle with schooling. But do you want to talk a bit about your experience?
Certainly, yeah. So my earlier years before we were put in the children's home were, I think I was indifferent. I mean, I was intelligent, but we didn't attend school very often. It was all very ad hoc. I think when he was aware enough to send us to school, pack our lunches, I don't remember any of that sort of thing. We would go to school. I remember my report, my grade 2 report was, there was a very large emphasis on he needs to attend school more often. You know, but following that, I mean, we went to a disadvantaged school. We lived in a disadvantaged area in a city, Melbourne. I lived in housing commission area. All of those housing commission kids went to the same school because it was the local school. I grew up with a lot of first generation refugees, so a lot of Vietnamese and Chinese and Turkish and so forth. So our school was basically just, if you could read and write, that was enough. But I think I just took an interest in reading. I took an interest in learning. I think it was because it was a way to escape as well. So by reading and developing that, I was escaping a reality world. So I was in a fantasy world. That's one of the things. And I think that was one of the things that I could excel in, because I probably wasn't the fastest kid or the strongest kid, but I could excel at being the smartest kid. So that was a way to gain distinction and recognition. Later on, when I became a teenager and I went to high school, I think I just really took over my own education. I went to my own parent-teacher nights, and I would talk to the teachers, and I didn't invite Dad, and he didn't really ask. And I just said, look, I'll go ahead and do it. When it came time to choosing your subjects, he had some, some input here and there, but I basically decided what it was that I wanted to focus in with my electives, what things I wanted to go into and where I wanted to progress forward. And he really, I think he just liked the idea that the grades were coming home okay, and he really didn't pursue it that far. I think because, and this is when I was around about 14, 15, that's when I started doing that. A little bit early when I was in, say, year 7, year 8, he might have gone to some parent-teacher interviews, but, year 7 and year 8, that's not really that important anyway. I think you're still, getting some, reading and writing at a higher level, that's all. But it was once I started getting to my year 9, 10, 11, and 12, that's when I started taking control of what it was that I wanted to study and how often. And my family life at that point started to degenerate once again. And he got back into alcoholism and he would binge for a while. So I secluded myself from the rest of my family. My brother and sister were basically parodies of my father. And I was different. Even at that age, I knew I was different than them. I didn't bond very well with them. And I basically spent my time in my room reading and studying. And I would spend weekends writing up my essays and doing really well with it. Whereas he was like, why don't you get out of the house and get fresh air? And I didn't really think that that was important. He would be, why don't you get some friends? Why don't you get a girlfriend? When I was your age, I had 10, 15 girlfriends. This is what I did. And then I had a friend who I spent a lot of time with, and at that age, you go, can I sleep over at their house? He goes, why do you want to sleep over at his house? Are you a poof? Is he your boyfriend? And then he would get my brother and sister along in a chorus and they'd just chant, Shane is a poof, Shane is a poof. And just all that sort of alienation from even my other brother and sister, because I was, I suppose, different than him. I remember him telling me quite plainly, you'll never be as smart as me. Don't think that you're smart. So he's always trying to sort of escalate himself above me, never letting me think that one day I could, surpass the master. So there was
and
that.
of all the 3 kids, you're the most like your mum. Like I've seen pictures of your mum. You look like her.
Physical looks, yes. I do. So
this is something that we talk about with alienation too. So when the child's
memory,
really, reminding of the,
Yeah.
So yeah, just the sort of touch. Once I hit about 16, my father decided he wanted to move back to Queensland, and I didn't want to go. I was in year 11 at the time, and I was doing the VCE, which is the Victorian Certificate of Education, which goes over year 11 and year 12, and that's counted towards my university entrance. And so I didn't want to stop partway and move to Queensland. I didn't want to leave where I was established. I had friends, I had a social network, social group. So I basically said, I don't want to move and I want to leave home. And he said, fine, if that's what you want to do. And I left home at 16 and I moved in with a friend from high school, and I moved in with him and his family. And I wrote letters, and we communicated that way, because even at that age, I mean, everyone had a house phone, but we didn't have a house phone. He didn't want to spend the money on a house phone, so we never had a phone or a phone number. So I would write letters to him and he would write letters back. And then after a while, an address got moved. He changed address and I changed address, and I just had no way of contacting him. But I didn't actually pursue it that far either. I didn't, you know, try to track down who he was. I was indifferent at that point. You know, I got a letter, I read it, I wrote a letter back, and it was just something, I suppose, mechanical, rather than this driving emotional bond I didn't have. I mean,
so
I
where
loved
was
him.
your mum at this point?
All right, so mum was a bit flaky at this point too. She was, like I said, my father had granted her visitation rights, and so we would see her every fortnight. We'd go away to her place for the weekend. I think at first it was just for the day, then after that became the weekend. But she was a bit flaky. She'd disappear for 6 months at a time. We wouldn't see her. Then she'd just rock up one weekend and things would resume. No questions asked, or not on our behalf. I remember sitting there waiting for her some weekends and she didn't turn up.
What was that like for you, Shane, when you were sitting there waiting for your mum to turn up? What was that space like?
Sometimes it was disappointment, other times it was relief. It just depended on what was happening, because I was a child. So that way I get to go and play and do my things.
Did it
with
feel like
some of the friends.
though?
I don't recall. I think it was more, maybe not rejection, just I think more of disappointment that she either forgot or didn't turn up. It was more about, I think it was just reinforcing things that my father would say about her attitude, her aptitude, her, you know, her lifestyle. It was just, she's unreliable. This is what women do. You know, I expected as much. You know, don't be disappointed. This is just how things are.
You mentioned.
So, sorry. No, go, Dawn.
I don't know if we want to talk about this yet, but I want to. You mentioned earlier something about that he wanted to kill your mother.
Oh yeah.
What was that like for such a young child to hear something to that extent?
Well, I don't know. It was just a matter of fact thing. He would say all sorts of things a lot of the time. So I just took it in stride. And that's why I don't recall, I think, as I was saying at the time, why he was meeting her or how he got the contact. That sort of memory's been eclipsed by this statement. And he even described how he was going to do it. So he was going to walk down the street, and I don't know if you can see me here. He even described how he got a kitchen knife. Actually, I got one here, and he got a kitchen knife, and he was say, I'll just walk with it held here in my arm, and then I'm just going to pull it out and stab her. You know, she's not going to get you. No one's going to have you children. That sort of, I think that was the gist of it. But I do remember that was the extent. Now, there might have been drunken bravado as well. You know, if anyone tries to do this.
That's pretty severe.
Yeah. But we were also, I suppose, indoctrinated that we don't identify with her. She's our mother, but she ran away and she left you kids, and she didn't want you. And so we get to say and do whatever we want to her or about her, and she has no rights now. She's not even an entity, a person.
Here we are back at the PA stuff again. It's insidious. So that's really interesting. So you went to live with your friend from school and his family. And what was that like for you when you moved into that space, Shane?
I suppose it was very much like when I was put into the children's home. So this is the thing. I mean, these people that I moved in were also living in the Housing Commission area with us, but they had a microwave. We never had a microwave. They had a video player, a VCR. We never had a video. We didn't even have a stereo. We had an old record player and an old TV. All right.
So it
And a
was
fridge.
fun.
So
It was interesting. There was a lot of things that drew you there, and I think I had some examples like that in my life as well. And that might be something very
yeah.
common. That
I felt that they lived in a wealthy paradise. Looking back now, I go, well, they were just basically the same. They were on the same sort of money. They just put their money in different endeavors, like not alcohol, for example, not cigarettes.
yeah.
They had a car. That was another thing. They had a car. Dad never had a car. Okay, not until much later on in our life did he get a car. I mean, when we were living in Melbourne in the city, we were in a city, so a car wasn't really that necessary. Although I did get a broken arm once, and we had to catch the tram to the hospital. But
Oh, wow.
you know, it was that sort of lifestyle. So when I lived with them, when I moved out of home and lived with them, it was in some ways like a step up socially for me, and I was happier. I was ascending, you know, an economics or social ladder.
Feeling a little bit of pride or thriving that a child should feel, right, Elise? I mean, that's kind of similar. That's similar to having a child.
Well, when I actually moved out, I moved out about, let's say 3 or 4 weeks, maybe even a month before he eventually left. And I actually had to walk, when I was walking through school, I walked past our house every morning. Sometimes I'd wave, sometimes I didn't see him, but I don't recall dropping in and visiting any more than maybe once or twice. Even though he was still there, we were gone. I'd moved out. So
when did he pass away, and did
all
you
right.
see him between then and when he
No.
passed away, and how did you find out about that?
So from the moment that I moved out of home at 16 and he eventually jumped in the car, because that was the other thing, he was not getting a moving van and taking all of our possessions. He basically sold everything off and just packed the car up with some clothes and drove off. I didn't want to live in poverty, even worse poverty than what we were already living in. I decided to leave home, and I never saw him again, ever. I maybe talked to him once on the phone, and I wrote letters until we lost contact. And from the point I lost contact, I didn't see or hear from him for about maybe 10 years. And then I found out that he'd passed when, let me see, as an adult, I was maybe 25 or so, or 26. I was in contact with my brother, and he's, you know, he's a, I wouldn't say a spitting image, but he's not a healthy citizen, let's say. He's got his own addiction problems and theft and criminal charges and things like that. And we were talking though, and yeah, then one day out of the blue, his girlfriend rang me up crying and says, "Oh, I just want to give you the bad news that your father passed 2 weeks ago." They didn't tell me for 2 weeks because I wasn't actually speaking with my brother at this point because he'd stolen money off me for heroin. I wasn't speaking to him, and his girlfriend rang me up and said, "Oh yeah, it was 2 weeks ago. By the way, the funeral's already been and your brother's gone to the funeral, but we didn't tell you because we didn't know how to tell you." So I never got to attend a funeral. And at the time, though, it was just an inopportune time. I was in the middle of moving house. I had furniture in my hand. So I just said, "Look, I can't deal with this right now, but thank you for the call." And I just carried on. And I suppose I suppressed that. I just suppressed that and moved on.
Wow.
So, yeah, that was how I found out.
That's
I suppose I'm a little bit annoyed that no one actually thought to ring me until 2 weeks after the fact. He was already buried at this time, put into the ground. I didn't know anything about it.
you didn't get to participate in the closure and the whole point of, you know, coming together as a family.
True. I mean, in some respects, I don't have that identity that he's dead. It's sort of like the whole Elvis myth, you know?
Yeah.
he's dead. We know he's dead, but there's also this thing where, you know, is he really dead? Because I never saw the funeral. I never attended the funeral. And I wasn't until I was in my mid-30s that I actually ever attended a funeral.
You don't know where he's buried either, do you?
No, I've got a good idea. It's not a big town, and I'd be able to find it if I wanted to do the research. So, and I think at one point later on in my life, I mean, as I said, I became an alcoholic, and with all of the that probably lowered my inhibitions, and I was able to grieve at some point, but it was a drunken grieving process. But so I did grieve for him, but you know, he was my father, and I did love him because he was my only parent for really, I mean, all of that time. Although my mother was there, she was more like an older sibling or an auntie. She was there but removed. She was a concept, not a person as a mother. So I did grieve for my father at some point, and I did love him. And sometimes I do miss him, but it's more about I just want to sort of show him how I've grown up and where I am. But I don't want a relationship. I don't grieve that I miss having him in my life. He was a violent, drunken asshole. A lot of the time, he was aggressive. He was belittling. He would alienate me from my siblings. He would do whatever he could to denigrate me. He would even play games where he would trick me into answering questions, and then emphasize how little I knew and how silly I was because I was a child asking silly questions. But he'd ask me questions and you'd answer it. Then he'd go, "Oh, you're an idiot for these reasons. That never work." And I resented that at the time. I really did, to be made to answer questions and then have my lack of intelligence or my ignorance, more ignorance. I was a child. I didn't know any better. To have that emphasized as a way for him to be superior.
Yeah.
So the key point here, Shane, is that you still loved him.
Oh, of course.
No matter what, he was still your dad. And this is what I think a lot of people don't understand when they're seeing families who grow up like this and they think the child will be better off out of it, blah, 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 blah. That's another argument for another day. But at the very, very core, the kernel out of this is you loved him still. He was your dad.
Yeah, he was my dad, and he did all of these things to me, and some of them are reprehensible, and I wouldn't do them to a dog. But he was still my father.
He
was
your
still
parent,
the person.
Yep, still your dad.
Still my dad. I mean, I suppose it was unconditional in many respects. It was my dad, and I loved him.
Well, and you just said that, you know, all these terrible things that he did to you, you could have, you know, turned out to be just like him. You could be repeating everything he did. But you just said you wouldn't even do that to a dog. So you've already broken that cycle and stepped out of that. So, I mean, and you know, the
conscious mind, though. Conscious mind. My unconscious or subconscious mind, sometimes I emulate him. Because that was my earliest indoctrination. You know?
So how do you move through that into a different class? Because you're what we would term middle class now. You have a professional job, high paying, very, very intellectual. You have a very responsible job. You're a very, very responsible citizen. You own a home. Like you are doing like everything. You pay all the taxes. You're not in active alcohol addiction at the moment. You're doing you do what you need to do to work with that so that you don't fall into those patterns, negative ones again. What information could you what could you give to any adult survivors of parental alienation or abuse or anything that you've grown up with that may be still thinking, I can't get out of this? Like, what would you say to them? Because you have.
Well, it's a difficult question. For many years, I was out of the area. Let's say I was out of the physical housing commission area, and like where I grew up, there was people in there. They were third or fourth generation housing commission. They're never going to break that cycle. because that was all they knew. And it's not because they wanted to live there. It was just that their horizons were so limited, they didn't think that there was anything else. This was their life. They got to a certain age, left school, got on the dole, tried to get a pension somehow, single mother's pension. That was always a thing. You know, there was so many young girls pushing prams. So that was their life cycle. And I think it was just that their horizons were so limited. I suppose, was fortunate in that I went to a school where I knew other kids who didn't have that same lifestyle. So I looked at their lifestyle and I said, I could be that. I knew I was smart enough to go further, and I didn't want to live in that in that life where my horizons were so limited that the best that I could ever hope for was to get maybe, you know, that that what do you call it, that baby bonus. Like, that was an idea of big money, getting a couple of $1,000s because you've had a baby, getting an upgrade on your pension so that through hardships or something like that. That was your idea of a raise, a pay rise, a life cycle update. That was not what I wanted to be. I had kids, friends that are associated with, who had families, who had jobs, you know, not just one, but both. They actually had two parents. That was another thing, which was also, you know, they had a mum and a dad at home. And I thought, well, that's how I want to live my life. I remembered when I was in the children's home and having that sort of life cycle. Even then, just having fresh, clean clothes, fresh food, new food, toys to play with, that was something that I wanted to aspire to. So that's what I aimed at. And I was able to, like I said, I left home at an early age, so I suppose that indoctrination seemed to stop. I endeavoured to do better. I wanted to get into university. I don't know why, but that was just the common thing at the time. You know, say again?
Determination, I think.
Yeah.
Some influence, and it gave you some determination to.
That's right. Our teachers were saying, you know, you got to get into university. University is the end all and be all. So that was what I strove towards. But I also struggled a lot. I was faking it at a very high level. So underneath all of that, I was a child who'd left home, who had no longer had any sort of boundary system. So my father, even though he wasn't the most supportive in certain respects, there was boundaries that he put into place. And the fear kept me within those boundaries. Once that was gone, I did become a bit more feral again. I lost any inhibitions that I had about my behavior or about what I was doing. So we started underage drinking from about 16 onwards. That was what we strived towards. While I was living at home, to avoid associating with my family, I studied a lot, spent my time in my room. I isolated myself on purpose, and I didn't associate with them. So I didn't sit around with them and just discuss whatever mundane banalities that they all discussed, and that was their life. When I left home at 16, my grades did deteriorate through my final year of high school, but enough for me to get into university. And then university just became, you know, they really do emphasize partying and drinking and cheap alcohol on campus and things like that. And they had social events all the time. And so for me, my first couple of years at university was just all about attending the next party, meeting girls, having sex with girls. That was a focus. Study was, and grades was the secondary. My friends that I was in class with, they did better because they actually had a stable family life, but I had nothing. You know, I was living in share homes and halfway houses, whatever you want to call them. I was boarding with people, then I'd moved in with other people. And then I moved in with some friends from high school, and that's where things really did degenerate. And university, I just didn't even attend anymore, and just quit one day. Just quit university. Didn't sign up for my next semester. I had we have a thing over here called Oz Study, which was basically a student thing. It's sort of like the dole, but for students. So it was a government benefit for students, and they would pay you a certain amount each fortnight or whatever, and that was what got you through rent and food and books and things like that. And after a while, even they stopped paying me. They said, mate, you're in a 3-year course. you've been there for 4 years, we're stopping, you know.
Wow.
We're not paying for you just to attend perpetually at university. So then I went on to the DOL, which was like job seekers benefit. And they said, what are you going to do when you get a job? And I said, oh, I'm just going to quit university. I was just so didn't care any longer, and I was just existing. So whatever was happening at the next moment was what I did, and I just did that. And I got a job part-time, which turned into full-time when someone left, and that was it. So I was a kid with high academic credentials and a lot of potential working behind the counter at a retail job. And I did that for years just because I had no motivation to do any further. I'd come so far and then it stopped. I got into drugs and alcohol, and basically I just worked for rent money and drugs and alcohol. I then was single for so many years because I never had a successful relationship, especially with my attitude towards girls. As I said, I never had a woman in my life as a mother or a mentor. And so my interaction with women was all about trying to get them into bed. And it's not a healthy way to build a relationship,
No.
especially with all the indoctrination I had about, you know, women. And I suppose there are also some abandonment issues there. So once one girlfriend left me after a couple of years of a relationship, and that ended badly, and she left me. After that, I suppose I went into a pretty dark place, and I really pushed the limit on drug and alcohol abuse of my body. And I think that was noticed in work and so forth. But anyway, so after a few years, I met someone that I knew, and she already had a child, and I just hooked up with her. I didn't chase her or pursue her, she pursued me, and I just went along with it. I had no real interest in her. I mean, later on I realized that.
And then you had a child with her.
Then I had a child
and
with her.
Basically, that was really full on rocky, and in and out, in and out, in and out. And then she left.
She left
like
one
3
day,
or 4
exactly the
states.
same. Yeah,
Right.
exactly the same way that my mother had left. So
With the baby, yeah.
with the baby, I was basically just spending all my time after work. I would go straight to the pub with friends from work, and I'd stay there until maybe 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. I'd get home, and she'd say, look, the kids are in bed for hours already. You know, the baby would be in bed at 6 or 7. You're not seeing your kids. You're in retail. You work weekends. You know, this is not a great lifestyle for any of us. And that degenerated. And she just, one day I come home, she wasn't there. Cat wasn't there. Washing machine wasn't there. She left. She left me a note on the mantelpiece, you know, the Dear John letter. And I really don't blame her. I wasn't the best person to be around because I was more focused on what I could do for me. And she was just a convenience at home, a concept, not a person. And yeah, so she left me exactly the same way I suppose my mother left me, in that maybe I identified with that at some point, that she's done that. I didn't focus on it at the time, but I basically just, I lost weight. I drank so much alcohol and so forth. I wasn't eating, and I just really degenerated for the next 10 years. And for that reason, I don't think she actively wanted me out of my daughter's life, but I was hurt and angry, and I acted the same way my father did. I never had anything nice to say about her, either in person or to other people. I didn't want to associate with anything. I had nothing to do with my child, and I just basically retreated into alcoholism, and I reveled in it. I thought that I was living the lifestyle. I was single and in the middle of the city now. I was living in the middle of Melbourne and just running amok at pubs and clubs after work every single night, and basically getting out of bed hungover in the morning, shaving, catching the train to work, and working probably in the same stinking clothes all the just getting through the day to the end of the day so that I can start to drink again.
I called that my pinball moment, where you know, when you play a pinball machine, the ball just kind of goes and it bounces and it's doing, but it's like there's no rhyme or rhythm to the direction that you're really going.
Yeah, I was in the current.
What's
And I just
that
wasn't swimming toward
turnaround
the
point
banks.
for you?
Let me see the turnaround point. I don't think there was a turnaround point until I met my wife. I mean, I'd been into some situations. I met some person and I was probably with them for a night. I had a lot of one-night stands, no permanent relationships, but I was just drinking and smoking all the time, as much as I could. The first thing I did on weekends when I had no work, first thing I'd do in the morning was start smoking drugs, and I'd do that the entire weekend, watching movies. I basically was living on the couch, and then the only time I left that was to have a shower and go to work. And then I'd come back and that's what I'd do. And then I think at some point you do come to a realization, I'm not happy with this lifestyle. I'm not actually living, I'm just existing. And I met someone and I realized that I could have a relationship. I bonded with her. I had a really good connection with her. And she lived interstate from me. So the relationship was long distance for a long time. And I think one of the things that attracted me to her was that she looked through all of the outer shit that I was exhibiting, my, obvious drug and alcohol addictions and lack of any direction. But I had a job and it was a pretty high paying job. It did enough so that I can pay the rent and buy more drugs every week. And
You're talking about marijuana here, aren't you?
Yes, smoking marijuana. So yeah, I basically spent the entire life that I wasn't at work, I spent it stoned, and I did that for like 15 years, drugged or drunk.
State of consciousness really kind of coping, more or less.
Yeah. I cope by not coping. I cope by ignoring everything to the point where if I got so drunk, and my level of getting drunk was to be falling over, unable to actually move and coherently move my limbs. I drank to absolute destruction and smoked to absolute destruction. And the point was I couldn't focus on anything else, only one thing at a time.
You didn't have to think.
I couldn't think. I did it so I couldn't think. And I didn't realize that until after.
Because we went 12 minutes past the top of the hour, and I know you had another appointment, but I think this is only just part of your story, so maybe we could have another one to continue.
I'd be glad to, yeah.
I just want to make sure you're not late for your appointment. Was it supposed to be at the top of the hour?
Yeah, at 11.
Keep going. I'm okay with either. It's up to you.
I probably should jump in on my other meeting.
Well, but, considering this is going to PA Awareness Day on the 25th of April, do you have anything to say to anyone out there who might be watching this, who's really stuck where they are, watching you, listening to you, who with regards to parental alienation, because your story touches on a lot of different things, trafficking, childhood sexual abuse, but with regards to PA, because this is where we're trying to shine the light at this point, do you have anything that you would like to say to parents who are alienating towards targeted parents, and the court system especially? What's it like for you now, knowing that this stuff is still going on and you're now 40? Can you just speak to that?
Yeah, certainly. So as I've already said, when my mother first left, my father didn't have anything really good to say about her. He would openly disparage her and denigrate her, and that actually expanded to all women. And so we were raised just with our father. We identified strongly as a very patriarchal sort of society, or in our family, it was very patriarchal, obviously. And women were very, very substandard. Even my sister grew up quite butch. Okay, he raised her as a boy, I suppose, in many respects. And it wasn't that I knew that what he was saying was not true or not correct. And I actually felt empathy for my mother when I first started contacting her again and having her in my life. I felt sorry for her because I think she was just a victim of her circumstances. She was trapped in a relationship that she didn't want to be into, and the only way she saw out was just to run away, because he would not be above holding her there and detaining her physically. So
15
she ran.
to 28. That's very controversial.
So she ran away. And there's parts of me that I think I grew up to have an unhealthy attitude towards women. And we had no other voice, no other way for the truth, I suppose, to get into. So this is what we, in many respects, were brainwashed into believing this. And I know that my brother and sister, although they have a relationship with my mother, it's not a healthy relationship. It's not a mother-daughter, mother-son relationship. It's probably a or a peer-to-peer relationship. They disrespect her openly. They use her. Okay, so she, at some point, guilt probably wants her in their lives, or whatever her motivation is. But they basically, they're not very nice to her a lot of the times. They openly are disrespectful, and just always got their hand out, asking. I think there is an expectation that she owes them something.
So what's your message to people who are practicing alienation and teaching children that it's okay to denigrate the other targeted parent, and who alienating parents who are openly denigrating the other parent? What's your message to them as a child who grew up with it?
These people who are denigrating the other partner are doing it because of their own personal hurt and their sense of rejections, and whatever their motivations are, they need to keep that to themselves and deal with it their own way. But to involve your children in that discussion, to actually actively get their input, and you get to stand on your soapbox and espouse why this person left us children, why this person was no longer in your life, and why they're just absolute terrible people, and to also then identify within us children those traits that our parent has demonstrated, and to say you're just like that person. That's not good. Though you may not think that has any long-term lasting effects, and you can look at me and say, well, you're well adjusted. I'm faking it at a high level. Underneath, I'm a person who exhibits a lot of things, and I have to have a very conscious awareness of my behavior so that I don't begin to emulate these things, because that's how I was trained from an early age. And I've often said in this interview that the way that you train a child is sometimes the same way that you can train a puppy. Okay, and you will learn to sit, drop, stay, and not eat out of the garbage. And you can train these children unknowingly to have an unhealthy adulthood.
Right.
You may not be aware that they're going to be misogynists. They're going to be alcoholics. They're going to be violent as well, because you're training them actively. That
you learn what you're taught.
You learn what you're taught, and you pick up as a child. That's when you're the most
absorbent mind period, between 3 and 6. Yes,
exactly. At that point, you are early trained, and that's very difficult to get rid of that training. Early on trained that, in my case, women can be disrespected. Women don't have value, and as an adult, you take what you want. Okay, as an adult male, you take what you want. They're only good for one thing.
So it's really interesting, because a lot of the, they say 83% of the custodial parents are the alienating parents. So your dad had custody, but it's a bit interesting, because it's often that, and this is not anything to do with gender, but the research is saying that often it's women who can be more of the alienating parent, but in this case it was your father. So you're a bit of an outlier in this. So it's really, really interesting if anyone's watching whose father is the alienator, not necessarily the mother. You're in a category that's quite unusual. So thank you for speaking today, and thank you for being so honest and sharing